Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited for today's video. I'm finally going to be sharing my 2021 year-end recap for my palette usage. That means today I will be sharing with you my most used palettes from 2021. I did already do a video on all of the unused palettes, or the palettes that went unused in my collection in 2021, and then I'll also be sharing some other just like fun nerdy statistics about my palette usage throughout this video. So if you're interested in seeing what palettes got the most use from me last year, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit chatting about makeup, I would love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. All right guys, can you tell I'm like trying to get all the use out of all the pink palettes I did in my February palette shop my stash? I don't know how I'm feeling about today's look, but we're just rolling with it. I'm not gonna lie, I've had a lot of fun creating a lot of pink looks this month, but I'm ready to move past the pinks. I feel like I've done so many pink looks, I'm kind of over it. So in 2020, I started to track my palette usage. I would, every time I reached into an eyeshadow palette, whether it be for one shade or just to create a whole look, I started to track how many times I used each palette, and then I would give quarterly updates. I did a year-end wrap up for 2020, which I can leave linked down below. And I'm here to finally wrap up the year of 2021 with you. So in 2020, I had a smaller eyeshadow palette collection. In 2021, I brought so many eyeshadow palettes into my collection. We got a little bit out of control. I'm gonna try and reel it in slightly in 2022. I did give myself a monthly limit to the amount of palettes that I can purchase. So we'll hopefully be bringing less palettes into my collection. But my palette collection in 2020 was significantly smaller than it was last year in 2021. In 2020, I used 29 eyeshadow palettes 10 times or more. And I thought it was really interesting that in 2021, I used 28 palettes 10 times or more, even though my palette collection grew by so much. And towards the end of 2021, I was not wearing makeup at all, which tells me in 2020 I was likely reaching into like less palettes to create a full look, whereas in 2021 I did find myself, I would have like 8 palettes open at a time and be like taking like one shade from each palette, which I definitely did when I did my look today. I'm pretty sure I used 8 palettes today. But regardless, my goal in 2022 is just to use my eyeshadow palette collection more wholly, and I'm very excited to track my progress there. I am doing monthly updates now on my progress, so I'll link my January video down below, and then if you're interested, you can check out all of the things. I'm rambling at this point, and we haven't even got into what this video is actually about, which is my most used palettes of 2021. So like I said, I had 28 palettes that I used 10 times or more, and that accounts for approximately 15% of my eyeshadow palette collection. So only 15% of my eyeshadow palette collection got used 10 times or more. 61% of my eyeshadow palette collection in 2021 was reached for anywhere between 1 and 5 times, and then 8% of my palette collection went completely untouched in 2021. 7% of my palette collection I used 20 or more times. Just to give you some, I love stats, I love percentages and things like that. I think it's just like fun to kind of put things into like a mathematical perspective, if you will. So that is where we sit, and I'm gonna share with you the 28 eyeshadow palettes that I reached for 10 times or more, and we'll start with the palettes that I used 10 times and move up to the palette that had the most usage for me in 2021. I reached for 36 total times, so we'll get there, but we're gonna start with the palettes that I reached for 10 times. So I have 3 palettes that I reached for 10 times in 2021. 2 of them were new to my collection as of 2021, and I was actually really surprised to see the Menagerie Pastel Pup palette got used 10 times. But then I remember that I did have this in a project pan, and I was trying to reach for each of the shades at least one time. So this palette I reached for 10 times. I don't know that I've yet used this palette this year. Have I? I can't remember. Another palette that I reached for 10 times last year was this one from Odenside. This is the Norns eyeshadow palette. And I feel like with a little bit of effort, I will hit pan on the shade Pink Chameleon. This palette was so much fun to me, and this is a palette that I just found myself wanting to reach for even after I had like tested it for review. I continue to want to reach for it, specifically like this bottom row of shimmer shades. I absolutely love and adore. I also love this shade right here, so I anticipate I will continue to use this one quite often in 2022. And then also my Rowan 75 degrees quad I reached for 10 times last year. This quad has been a favorite of mine. I know today I used the Rowan 1111 quad a little bit on my eyes, and I really do enjoy these quads. I think they're a little bit overpriced, and I've had them in my collection for over a year now, and the textures have definitely dried out a little bit, which is a bummer, but I hope to continue to reach for both of my Rowan quads more in 2022. The next two palettes I reached for 11 times in 2021. The first palette is my Colored Rain Queen of Hearts palette, and oh, I wanted to point out whether or not each of these palettes have pan in them. So the three that I just showed you, none of those have eyeshadow pans in them. I just thought it would be fun to kind of like look at how many times the palette was reached for and whether or not it has pan. This shade right here, you can't really tell. It is a really deep shade, and because of like the shadow, like the shade of the shadow as well as the eyeshadow pan, you can't tell unless it hits the light just right. But I do have a pan in this shadow right here. I believe I was working on this in a project last year, but I did reach for that 11 times. And I also reached for the NARS Summer Solstice palette 11 times last year. This ended up being a favorite palette of mine in the summer, and if I had continued to do my makeup more frequently towards the end of 2021, I anticipate I would have used this one a bunch. I'm so excited to pull this one back out for the summertime as well. Honestly, this is like a very neutral, could be worn at any time palette, but I loved this last summer, and I anticipate this one will get used at least 10 times again this year as well. This next palette, the Sydney Grace Tiny Marvels palette, I reached for 12 times last year. I remember at like I remember in like August or perhaps even September, I had not reached for this palette at all last year, so I made a valiant effort to reach for this one more often, and I reached for it 12 times. I was using this shade as a brow powder for quite some time last year, or well, probably 12 times last year, but I did reach into this for other shades as well for those 12 uses. I anticipate I will pull this out and use this as a brow powder again at some point. I am currently working on panning a different brow powder, but this has already gotten some use out of me in 2022 as well, and I do really look forward to reaching for this one again come like the springtime. This is like, I don't know, for some reason this like gives me spring vibes, and I'm excited to pull this out in the springtime. Next up on my list is the Natasha Denona Mini Glam eyeshadow palette, and I reached for this a total of 14 times. I think the majority of those 14 uses were to reach into this shade right here as an inner corner highlight. I reach into my Natasha Denona mini palettes quite frequently for inner corner highlights. I know currently I have been focused on a shade in the Natasha Denona Mini Love palette. It actually is in my inner corner today. I'm trying to hit pan on that, and I have a feeling I will circle back to this one at some point this year and try and hit pan on this shade right here. I love my Natasha minis. They're very handy, very easy to use, and I want to get some more pans throughout my Natasha Denona collection this year, so you'll probably see this one again in next year's recap. So of the 7 eyeshadow palettes that I've shared with you thus far, only one of them has had pan on it, which I find very interesting. But my 8th palette is the Tarte Love Trust and Fairy Dust palette. I reached for this one a total of 16 times, and this one actually has 2 eyeshadow pans in it. This was going in my palettes on their last 2 Raw series last year, which was supposed to be a series where I decluttered palettes at the end of that, and I did declutter quite frequently throughout the course of that series, but there were some palettes that I planned to declutter that I ended up keeping, this being one of them. This is again going in my palettes on their last 2 Raw series, which has kind of turned into like a chopping block style of series, if you will. I'll leave that link down below. I'll leave all of my palette content linked down below for you guys, but I reached for this 16 times. I have not yet reached for this one this year. Again, it is, I think I included this on my palettes on their last Raw. Maybe I didn't for this year, but I would love to hit pan. Some of my shades have started to break. Like this palette is pretty beat up, but I would love to see if I could hit pan on like 2 more shades in this by the end of the year. I would feel so proud of myself if I did that, but This palette I reached for 16 total times in 2021. I have 2 palettes that I reached for 17 times in 2021, one of them being the Nabla Nude Cutie palette. I was kind of surprised by this, but also kind of not surprised by this. I don't have a pan in this one, so we're at 2 out of 9 palettes have pan on them. But I reached into this shade, I remember quite frequently, obviously as an inner corner highlight. Whenever you see that little mini dip, that's always like my little inner corner highlight brush. But I do kind of want to reach into this one again for like these shimmer shades. I know when I reviewed this, I was saying I don't really love the formula of these like chunkier mattes, but then for some reason I found myself last year going into this quite frequently for this latex nude shade. Maybe I could hit pan on a couple of shades throughout this little quad as well. You guys know I love Nabla Cosmetics. I love their eyeshadow formula. They have quite a few different formulas within their palettes. I have another Nabla palette to share coming up. Like I love my Nabla eyeshadow. So the 10th palette and another palette that I reached for 17 times was my Too Faced Pumpkin Spice palette, and I do have an eyeshadow pan on this one right here. I was working on this in a project pan, and this is one that I have put away for a little bit just because I feel like I'd been getting a ton of use out of it, and now I'm ready to take a break. But I anticipate I'll pick this one back up come next pumpkin spice season. And yeah, I don't really have a lot more to say about this other than I reached into this one 17 times. I remember most of it was for the lid setting shade, but I did create a couple of looks in the fall of last year using this palette, and again I'm very excited to pull this one back out fall of this year. The next palette I reached for 18 times, and this is the Nabla, so I'm holding the Dreamy palette. It's the Nabla Dreamy 2 that I reached for 18 times, but I have searched high and low and I literally cannot find my Nabla Dreamy 2, which makes me so sad because I absolutely love the Nabla Dreamy 2 palette. The Nabla Dreamy 1, not so much. I don't know why I'm even opening this. I know that my Nabla Dreamy 2 palette has multiple pans in that eyeshadow palette. So that would put us at 4 out of the 11 palettes that are in this list having pan on it. But yes, my Nabla Dreamy 2, I'm hoping I can like dig around and find that, because that was one in 2020 that I had used a really high amount of times as well. It's just one of my favorite palettes. Again, another Nabla palette. I love Nabla Cosmetics. Nabla, hit me up. But yeah, that one I reached for 18 times. The next 2 eyeshadow palettes I reached for 19 times each. So up first I have the Canyon palette from Alter Ego. I'm actually currently working on this in my current Pan Those Eyeshadows project, but last year I did end up hitting pan. I don't know if you'll be able to see, there is a pan on the shade Expanse right here, which I did use as a brow powder last year. I really did enjoy this palette. I think I purchased this towards the beginning of last year and obviously got quite a bit of use considering like my entire collection. And I do have a pan on this palette. And then the other palette that I reached for 19 times, another palette I brought into my collection last year, was the Nomad palette from Juvia's Place. And again, this one also has a pan in a shade I was using as a brow powder. You guys will notice I have a lot of like dark brown shades with pan that I use as a brow powder, as well as the lid setting shades. I kind of try and like cycle through things and hit pan on them. I am excited to reach into this one come this fall. I don't feel like, because I wasn't doing my makeup that frequently this past fall, I really got to like enjoy the experience of my fall makeup and fall palettes, but this is such a gorgeous one for the fall time. So hopefully this one will again be in next year's recap, but only time will tell. All right, you guys, that brings us to our top 10 most used eyeshadow palettes from 2021. So up next we have the Artemis palette, which I reached for 20 total times, and I do not have an eyeshadow pan in this palette. I purchased this towards the beginning of 2021. I never purchased the Natasha Denona Metropolis palette, even though I do not need that palette, especially because I have this palette. I think the formula in this palette is really good. I still always like give the Nabla Metropolis the side eye. But yeah, this I was working on a couple of shades I think in my Pan Those eyeshadows and just was not successful. This is another one I'll be really excited to pull out in the fall, and potentially sooner than that. Maybe I'll pull this out. Ooh, this would be a good one for possibly my March Shop My Stash. We'll have to do that. The Urban Decay Stone Vibes palette I also reached for a total of 20 times. I was working on hitting pan in this shade right here, and I even like kept this one pulled out to try and hit pan on it, but then I like stopped doing my makeup altogether. So I am still hoping this year I can hit pan on this shade. I actually really enjoy this palette from Urban Decay. This is like, I feel like this one deserved more hype than it got, and I'm just so happy to have this in my collection. I anticipate this will be one of my high reused palettes this year as well, just because it's just a fun one. It's a fun one, and I need to pull this one out. I have two palettes I reached for 21 times. Up first, I have the Too Faced Natural Nudes palette. This is the Born This Way palette. I do have a pan in the lid setting shade right here. This is another one I brought into my collection last year, and obviously wanted to hit a pan in this. This is also a palette that's just very good for your everyday makeup consumer, everyday average makeup user. I wore this one quite frequently. You use this quite frequently to create looks to wear to work, and I used this 21 times. And then also the Nabla Side by Side palette, another Nabla palette. I reached for this a total of 21 times as well. I have another pan in the lid setting shade in this one, and I've reached for this quite a bit just for all of the shades in this. This is one of my favorite palettes in my collection, a palette I highly recommend, and a palette I anticipate you will see again next year when we recap my most used palettes. Next up, we have my Natasha Denona Mini Nude palette. I ended up dropping this, so it's like very broken, and I do have a pan in this one. I actually have two pans. I have a pan in this shade and this shade. I don't want to open the case because I just feel like it's going to be messy. I reached for this 24 times. I remember I went through like a phase where this was like, I swear, the only palette I was reaching for, and I was creating full looks with this like every time I reached for this. So it wasn't like I was just reaching into this for the inner corner highlight. It was like I was like going in and created like 24 separate eye looks just with this palette. I was so obsessed with this. I still absolutely love this eyeshadow palette. I would even consider like purchasing another one to replace this one if it gets to be too messy, because this is one of like my tippity top favorite palettes in my collection as well. The ABH Sultry and the ABH Jackie palette, I reached for both of these 26 times. I do have one pan in the Jackie palette right here. You guys know I rave about this palette all the time as well. I talk about this as being one of my favorite palettes in my collection, so I am very happy that the palettes that are in the top 5, top 10 in my collection are ones that I do actually genuinely speak about being favorites, because sometimes I'm like, oh, I swear that palette's a favorite, but I haven't used it at all, it seems like, when you actually start tracking your progress. So I was really excited to see this as one of my higher used palettes, just because this is one of those palettes that I find myself finding excuses not to reach for it because I like want to save it for special occasions, and I do that thing that's just so silly. So I reached for this 26 times, and then I was not surprised to see my Sultry palette as one of my most used palettes. I also reached for this 26 times. I have 4 pans in this palette. This is, again, one of my absolute favorite palettes. I think this may have been my most used palette of 2020. It has definitely been in my top couple of palettes the last 2 years that I've been tracking, and I'm sure we will see this again next year in my top used palettes. Okay, this next palette I was surprised to see, but then I was like, oh yeah, I was using it to try and hit pan on a brow setting shade, and it is the Melt Mary Jane palette, and I did end up hitting a pan in this palette. I have pan in this shade right here, which I was using as a brow setting shade. Can you guess it? This palette I purchased when this launched last year, or like around launch time, and I have to say I was a little bit disappointed in the quality of this one. The mattes are fine, but there's just a couple, like the shades I was most excited for, which are Mary Jane and Sweet Lucy. They're just like really chunky, so it's a very messy palette. You need to use a glitter glue, and you'll likely still have fallout on your face throughout the day. So I love the looks that I've created with this, but it's always really messy, and it's just like a palette you have to be incredibly careful with, and just be really cognizant of like the fallout that you're gonna get with this. So I can't say that this is a favorite of mine, but now that I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, I kind of want to like pull this out and use it again because it's been a little bit. All right, we're into the top 2. My second most used palette of last year was the Urban Decay Born to Run palette. I have 3 total pans in this eyeshadow palette as well, and this was a palette that was going in my palettes on their last 2 raw, and I fell in love with this palette last year. I was wanting to reach for this. I was excited to reach into this palette and create not necessarily full looks with this palette, but I did end up focusing on Blaze last year. These are incredibly deep pans. They're very hard to hit pan on, so I was very focused on that last year. I would like to maybe try and hit pan on Ignite or Smog this year. Maybe I'll try and focus on one of those two shades, but this got a ton of use out of me last year. I want to say this was one of my higher used palettes in 2020 as well. So this is a frequent flyer and a frequent palette that gets used by me. All right, that brings us to my most used palette of 2021, and I can honestly say this is not a favorite palette of mine, which is crazy that my most used palette isn't like a favorite, but it is the Too Faced Palm Springs Dream palette. I do have a pan on the lid setting shade in here, and boy, did it take forever to hit pan on that lid setting shade. I ended up reaching into this palette 36 times last year, and I can say it probably took me 36 uses to hit pan on this shade. It was just really firmly pressed, and it is like a deeper-ish pan, but those were most of my uses. I didn't create much else from this palette. I know a couple of times I think I reached into Buzzkill and perhaps TFTI, but aside from that, I mostly just reached into this for the lid setting shade. So it's interesting to kind of like look through the top used palettes in my collection and like see, I'm very happy to see some of my very, very favorite palettes are some of my most used, but it is funny to just see some of these other like random palettes throughout. I would be discouraged. I would feel pretty guilty if I didn't have some of the palettes that I claim as favorites in this list. So I am really happy. I'm happy with the variety of palettes, and I'm very excited to see what 2022 will bring. I already feel like I'm using some of my palettes, like I feel like my percentage of palettes that I reach for 10 or more times in 2022 is going to be much higher than 15%. Fingers crossed, that's the goal. But that is going to wrap it up for today's video, talking to you about my most used eyeshadow palettes of 2021. I would love to know, do you do any sort of tracking of how much or how frequently you use your eyeshadow palettes? What were your most used palettes in 2021? I would love to know. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.